Hi, everybody. It's Maria Carter Giannini again. I'm here to bring you and your students another California history lesson. So same disclaimer as last time. I am not a fourth grade teacher, but I am a high school history teacher. So I've been creating these lessons really geared towards California history because my fourth grader is one of those students who is learning California history. So in our time of coronavirus quarantine, so I'm bringing a lesson each week. So our focus today is going to be on the Transcontinental Railroad and Chinese immigration. So those are our focus points today. So we'll start with some background on the railroad, major events and people. There'll be a background video in there as well. We'll talk about Promontory Point in Utah, where the two railroad lines come together at the Golden Spike. We'll talk about the challenges that the people building the railroad faced, impact on Native Americans and the environment, the use of Chinese laborers on the railroad, and then we'll also listen to a story called Coolies by an author by the name of Yin. And then we'll take a look at trains today. So we'll take a brief look at bullet trains of Japan. There'll be some activities mixed in here as well. If you're a fan of Google Docs, there is one there if you want to use that. Definitely not required or necessary for the lesson today, but if it's helpful, go ahead and use that today. So you can just make a copy and away you go. Okay, so I like to always start with a question for our students. So really trying to connect with their prior experience with travel. So you might ask them, if you're gonna travel somewhere, how would you get there? So imagine you're gonna be traveling from California to New York. How long would that take you with our modern day access to travel? So you probably get answers like, it might take better part of a day. It's definitely not going to be taking weeks or months. So we're going to be really talking about the different kinds of methods of travel that a long time ago, when we're talking about the 1860s and 70s, the only real way to get across the United States was to walk or ride a horse, or you could try to take a boat. So we talked about a lot of those last week when we looked at the gold rush. We definitely delved into the advantages and disadvantages of each of those modes of travel. So definitely take a look at those if you haven't already. So the railroad becomes a total game changer. So we're going from it taking months to cross the United States to it taking really only a week. So it's a really big change. So all aboard for exploring the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a good time for some vocabulary, asking our students what they think transcontinental means. So see if they can take that word apart. They probably have a good idea of what a continent is. And so our answer here is that this is a way to travel across a continent. So we're going to use a video to kind of set the stage for us here.
East meets west at Utah's Promontory Summit, the spot where we just celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. As John Blackstone explains, East met west there in more ways than one.
It's something railroad enthusiasts believe they might never see again. One of the biggest steam locomotives ever built back on the tracks, rumbling west under its own steam. As Union Pacific number 4014 pulled out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, crowds lined the tracks, waving at engineer Ed Dickens, urging one more pull of the whistle.
I don't know what it is about that whistle. We hear whistles, we hear horns in our life, but the steam locomotive whistle is really something that just moves you.
Dickens led the small team of Union Pacific workers who spent 5 years toiling to bring the massive machine back to life. Just give me some idea of the scale of this. I mean, these wheels are almost as big as we are.
This is 17,000 pounds all by itself, without everything else hanging off of it.
4014 is one of just 25 locomotives built in the 1940s, aptly named Big Boys. 132 feet long, weighing more than 1 million pounds, producing 7,000 horsepower. But when the age of steam came to an end in the late 1950s, 4014 became obsolete. Until Dickens and his team brought it back to life. Their goal was to get 4014 rolling again in time to celebrate one of the greatest rail accomplishments ever, the Transcontinental Railroad, built at the urging of President Lincoln.
It's very humbling that all of the sacrifice, the tremendous human effort to build something as complex as a set of railroad tracks across territory that many people have never even been across before.
Crews worked from both the East and the West, finally meeting on May 10th, 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah.
And we call it the moonshot of the 19th century. It was impossible. It was an impossible dream.
At Golden Spike National Historical Park, rail fans dressed in style to mark the anniversary,
Well,
if not always with historical accuracy. President Lincoln, this was all your idea, was it not?
I wasn't the only one that had the idea, but I was thankful to have a big part of it.
Replicas of Victorian steam engines rolled in for a reenactment of the legendary photo celebrating the driving of the Golden Spike. But the faces in that photo from 150 years ago look much different from those gathered here this time.
It took 150 years to gain that recognition. So our history is now coming alive.
They are descendants of the Chinese laborers who made up about 90% of the workforce on the western portion of the railroad.
The workers on the line who cleared the way for the railroad, who laid the roadbed and laid the track, laid the ties and so forth, and then especially did the tunnels, was almost exclusively Chinese.
Gordon H. Chang, a history professor at Stanford University, is the author of a newly released book on the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. The gold rush had brought thousands from China to California in the 1850s. When construction of the railroad began in 1863, the Chinese were not the first choice to work in it.
There was belief that they were either temperamentally or physically unfit for railroad work, but workers they hired on did very, very well for them. They were very, very pleased. Ultimately, they hired up to 20,000 workers.
Not only was the Chinese labor force plentiful, the workers were paid less than whites doing the same job. And the work was hard. They took on the most challenging portion of the Transcontinental Railroad, California's Granite Mountain Range, the Sierra Nevada.
15 tunnels had to be blasted, carved out through the Sierra Nevada. The Chinese carved out those 15 tunnels, the longest one being over 1,600 feet in length. And it took more than 2 years using only hand tools and black powder.
In the newspapers of the day, Chang found recognition for the contribution the Chinese rail workers were making to a growing nation.
To read the history.
Jeff Lee, a retired dentist from San Jose, California, is inspired by the hard work his great-grandfather did.
They don't come over as Hulk, right? They come over as pretty much me, right? And they learn to adapt to what they had to do physically, mentally, emotionally, as individuals and as groups.
And Lee is proud of where these tracks have taken his family.
Doctors, dentists, architects, UC Berkeley, Yale, Princeton.
But soon after the railroad was finished, the nation's mood began to turn against the hardworking immigrants.
With the rise of the anti-Chinese movement, the earlier history of what they did in California is great. The Chinese are driven out in town after town and their homes destroyed. The Chinese became undesirable, and therefore you don't want to include them in the history of the country.
That erasure is what the descendants gathered at Promontory Summit wanted to set right.
So this is Lin Lip Hong, my great-great-grandfather. He came here when he was 12.
So he was on his way back to China, but he stopped in San Francisco and said, no, this is my home. I love America.
Much has changed in 150 years for families and for the railroad. The old steam locomotives that originally traveled these rails were replaced by massive machines like 4014. But even this giant had to finally give way to modern diesels. Still, there is value in preserving the memory of all that came before. Locomotives, the tracks, and those who built them.
Okay, so hopefully that was good information. So that gives us a lot to work with. For sure. So I always like to work with maps, especially with students. So this is a map of the United States in 1860. So you want to point out that our East Coast looks pretty much the same, with the exception we don't have West Virginia yet. But other than that, things look pretty much the same. So if you were to look at a modern day map of the United States, that would be similar. But once you hit this line here, if you follow that line, the edges of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas, and Louisiana, that looks a little bit different than what we have today. So we have a lot of unorganized territory where modern day Oklahoma is. This is eventually going to become known as Indian Territory. Got Kansas Territory, Nebraska Territory, Washington Territory. So you'll notice that California by this time is a state. That is going to be our focus for next week. So looking at the admission of California as a state and how that is going to impact the Civil War. So tune in next week for that one. So part of the reason why I want to focus on this is because so much of this area is unincorporated at this point. It's going to be easier for the American government to take some of that land and use it for the railroad. Should be noted too that a lot of Native American tribes on these lands at this time as well. So major events here for our purposes, 1862 is a really important year. So this is the year that the US Congress passes the Pacific Railway Act. So this is a way to organize how this is going to go. So there's going to be two private companies that are going to build the railroad, one going from the east and one going from the west, and they will meet somewhere in the middle. And they really have no idea where that middle is going to be. So they're just going to kind of roll with that a little bit. So the importance of this too is that you have government putting money towards this. So it's not just these two private companies. So we're getting government involved here. In 1864, the first Chinese are hired to work on the western portion, and they're going to be given the most dangerous jobs of all. And so we're going to be exploring that a little bit later on in the presentation. So they're going to be in San Francisco and moving east. They are going to meet together in 1869 on May 10th at Promontory Point in Utah. So this is the Golden Spike. So they nail in a golden spike there. You can actually go and visit it there at the museum in Utah. So that's where it comes together. And again, they had no idea where these were going to meet. So once they figured out that this was going to be the meeting spot, they did kind of have to hustle and figure out and pull this all together. Important to note the rule of photography here as well. So the 1860s, this is a fairly new art form. You may have seen in the past photographs of Abraham Lincoln. So this is really the first time that we're utilizing this kind of medium or art form. And so this is really important for people who are super excited about the railroad. They're seeing pictures of what these workers are doing in their newspapers all across the country. I think we're probably all familiar with the name Stanford. So Stanford University. Leland Stanford is a really crucial person here. So he's from New York, so not from the West Coast in any way. Becomes a lawyer, sets up a law firm in New York, but then ends up moving out to California with his wife in the 1850s. And so he's over there because of the gold rush. So last week we explored what it was like for our miners versus our shop owners. So he was one of those shop owners. So he was one of the people that was actually very successful and made a lot of money in the process. So much so he starts to amass some power. He becomes the governor of California in 1861, and then 2 years later, he's going to become the head of the Union Pacific Railroad. So this is one of those private companies that's building the railroad. He makes a lot of money. He's very successful, so he sets up shop in Palo Alto. But sadly, his son dies at the age of 15, and so it was in his son's honor that he creates Stanford University. So this is an image from Promontory Point. So again, this is the meeting point of the two railroads. So you've got the workers here being photographed. You'll probably notice that there are no Chinese in these images. So that's something that the descendants of the Chinese rail workers have worked hard to really tell their ancestors' stories. So unfortunately, they're left out there. So a painting of the same event there. And this is the Golden Spike there on the left. So again, you can go and see the Golden Spike if you ever are in Promontory Point in Utah. So this is a replica of the Jupiter, so one of the trains that was used at Promontory Point. So there are people that do reenactments every year at these locations. So after the railroad was built, this is a huge change because now it will only take you a week to travel from coast to coast for about $65. And so if you think back to our presentation last week, taking those boats would cost hundreds of dollars. So this is huge. This is a total game changer. This is going to make the exchange of ideas and products and people so much faster and so much easier. So this is going to tie our country a lot closer together as a result. This is great news for farmers too. So if you're a farmer and you're growing wheat, you're no longer, restricted to just people in your area. So now you can sell your products across the country. So a lot of challenges to a big project like this. Weather was probably one of the biggest ones. So you're going from avalanches to heat stroke because you're all over the country. Native Americans, as you can imagine, are not very pleased about what's happening here. So they are taking over land, turning that into the track for the railroad. The main source of food for a lot of the Native American tribes in this area was the bison or the buffalo. And buffalo, if you've never seen them, they are quite large creatures, so thousands of pounds large. And if they don't want to move, then they don't move. So that's a problem if you're trying to build a railroad track. So there are, railroad companies are hiring sharpshooters, so people to shoot the buffalo to try to get them off of the track. So you can imagine tribes that depend on the buffalo are not very happy about this. So some of them are going to be attacking the railway workers and that sort of thing. The exception here is the Pawnee tribe. So they aren't nomadic. They aren't following the buffalo as they travel throughout the plains. So they are going to be protecting the railway. And so they're protecting the US government's ideas here. There's lots of dangerous methods here, as you saw in the video, especially in the Sierra Mountains. So if you're familiar with the Tahoe region, so the Sierra Nevada mountain range, they're going to have to tunnel through these mountains because you need a flat surface for the train to travel through them. So they're using dynamite, they're using nitroglycerin, so lots of explosives that are very dangerous. So those workers were getting an extra $1 a month to do that very dangerous work. So they would lower them down in baskets and they would place the explosions on the rock and just hope that they can get out of the way in time before it blows. And even with this system, they're only blasting out 1 foot a day. And some of these tunnels are just hundreds of miles long. So this is just to give you kind of a visual sense of the scale of some of these projects. So this is the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, so these big trestle bridges. Again, if you're familiar with the Tahoe area, this is the Donner Pass Summit. This was one of the most challenging tunnels that was built for the railroad. So they no longer use it today, but you can hike through today if you're visiting the area. And this is a good time for a math activity. So how far is San Francisco to Promontory Point? So we're in San Jose, so we started there. So we said if it's 50 miles from San Jose to San Francisco, and the distance from San Francisco to Promontory Point in Utah is 15 times longer, how many miles would it be from San Francisco to Promontory Point? So do a little math problem there. So 50 times 15. If you need the answer, let me know, and I'll be happy to give that to you. Another activity idea here is to make a historical marker. So this is a whole job for a lot of people, is to create these markers. So at very important historical places. So again, we're from San Jose, so I use the Winchester Mystery House as an example here. So put an image of that there. So this is kind of, the most basic information that someone should have about a location and why it's important. So a good activity would be to imagine it's your job to create the historical marker for Promontory Point in Utah and think about what details you would include. Why is this such an important place? And what should people know about it? You could make this into an art activity as well. You could draw your historical marker. And you could also think about if there's a place in your neighborhood or your town that you think deserves a historical marker and why. So have fun with that one. Okay, so who's doing the act work on the railroad? The vast majority is being done by immigrants. So the ones that are working on the East Coast, moving west, tend to be Irish immigrants. And then the people working on the West Coast section are from China. So that's our focus for the rest of today, really. So why were the Chinese chosen to be the workers here? They were assumed to be hard workers, and the most important part for the railroad companies was they were willing to work for lower money, lower amount of pay than their American counterparts. So they're going to be experiencing a great deal of discrimination in this experience. So in this time period, They are not allowed to become citizens, so they can't even go through that citizenship process. They are barred from that, or they would be stopped from that. They can't own property, so they can't own a house, they can't own a business, they can't vote in American elections, they can't testify in court, and they could not marry a non-Asian person. So white men who are working on the railroads are making $35 a month plus room and board. So room and board means you're given a place to sleep or live, and you're given food to eat. The Chinese, on the other hand, are paid less. They're paid $25 a month, and they're gonna have to pay for their own supplies, including their own food. Chinese are gonna be paid an extra $1 a month when working on the tunnels with the explosives. This is a good time to introduce push and pull factors in immigration. So it's a little bit of an advanced idea, but I think it can be brought down for our fourth graders. The idea that if you're living in a foreign country and things aren't so good, there's going to be things that would push you to consider picking up all of your belongings and moving to a new country. So that would be things like poverty. You don't have very much money, or there's a war going on and you don't want to be in the middle of it. There aren't enough jobs. You don't have any chances to really improve your station or your life. Pull factors are what would be pulling you from another nation. So hearing stories about the United States being the land of opportunity and everyone having a job who wants one, that your kids can go to school and things like that. So those are push and pull factors. A powerful image here of the baskets that the workers are being lowered down into to place the explosives into the rock there, and then you can see other workers laying the track down below. And you've got some sort of landslide happening here with the use of the explosives as well. All right, so the next step is we're going to be taking a look at some literature. So this is from a book called Coolies by Yin. So a little bit of an older book, but still a valuable one, I think. So a nice tactic is to use a pre-test. So some of these students should be able to answer already because we've covered it. So maybe take a minute and have the students go through each one of these questions and come up with a true or false. So what do they think? Is this a true statement or a false statement? Chinese immigrants were the only non-American workers on the railroad. True or false? Coolies was a nickname given to the Chinese because they were such good workers. Everyone who worked on the railroad received the same amount of money. The Chinese workers helped the Central Pacific Company and build it from west to east, starting in San Francisco. Chinese immigrants considered America the land of opportunity. Transcontinental means the railroad went all the way across the country. And Chinese immigrants worked in other businesses besides the railroad. Okay, so now we're going to be listening to the story. So this is about just under 20 minutes. If this is something you don't want to do with your student, feel free to just fast forward through the video about 19 or 20 minutes. And there's some questions at the end for kind of comprehension to see what they've understood.
Coolies by Yin. Illustrations by Chris Sondpeet. Coolies. Every year, Pawpaw, my grandmother, prepares a special feast of tofu, mushrooms, vegetables, and winter melon soup in honor of the Qingming festival. On this occasion, we crouch on our knees and kowtow with the burning incense in our hands before we eat. Why are we bowing to a bowl of oranges? I asked one year. Pawpaw laughs. We are not bowing to the fruits. This is how we show respect and honor our ancestors. Our ancestors? I say. Yes, your ancestors, she said. Let me tell you of two we do not forget. Of my Bok Gong, my great-grandfather, and his brother. A long, long time ago in China, in the mid-1800s, there was a rebellion against the government by the people. Our poor country. Thousands died of hunger because the crops weren't planted or harvested. Thousands could not find work. Your great-great-great-grandfather, Shek, was among them. News of laborers needed in America quickly spread throughout the village of Canton. Desperate for work, the family decided that Shek and his little brother Wang should go to this new land. They would have to leave their little brothers and mother behind in China. "Ma, don't worry," Shek reassured her as he packed. "I will send money home, and our family will starve no more. And I will take care of little Wang, I promise." The two brothers bowed goodbye to their family and boarded the overcrowded ship with hundreds of others frantic for work. The motion of the ship made many seasick, especially little Wang. Eventually, he got used to the movement of the ocean waves, but their sea voyage was agonizing and long. To help pass time, Shek and Wang would fish by tying pieces of rags to their hooks and tossing the line over the ship's railing. During the steel-cold nights, Shek made sure his little brother had enough hot tea and blankets to stay warm. After almost 2 months on the stormy seas, they finally arrived in San Francisco. Like many others on board, Shek and Wang were frail from their exhausting trip. However, the brothers were excited. "Look, little Wang, this is the land of opportunity," Shek exclaimed as he stared out at the new world. Horses and wagons met them at the ship. Shek made sure he was close to his little brother as the Chinese were separated into groups heading for Sacramento. "Stay close," Shek whispered. Chinese laborers had been hired by the Central Pacific Railroad Company to build railroad tracks headed east. Irish railroad workers had been hired by the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and starting from Omaha, Nebraska, they headed west. When the two railroad companies met in Utah, passengers and cargo would be able to cross the continent in days instead of months. The bosses hired by Central Pacific did not believe the Chinese could endure the building of the railroad. On average, they were skinny and looked upon as mere weaklings. The bosses made fun of their straw hats, pajama-like clothes, and even their long queues, braids which they wore down the center of their backs. Coolies, they called the Chinese, lowly workers. The Chinese laborers began each day at dawn and continued until dusk. Side by side, Shek and Wang worked with heavy sledgehammers that they slammed into the spikes until their blistered hands bled. The cart full of tools and supplies would trail up and down the rail line as the workers hammered under the beaming hot sun. Day by day by day, they labored through desert hills, through meadows, and across steep cliffs, until they were met by rows of mountains, which the foreman called the Sierras. The loud whistle sounded each evening, a signal to the end of a hard workday. When the Chinese laborers returned to their camps, the cooks prepared hot water in tubs so the exhausted workers could bathe. The brothers also looked forward to mealtime, when the cooks prepared their favorite Cantonese dishes: rice with dried fish, mushrooms, bamboo shoots, vegetables, pork, seaweed, salted cuttlefish, noodles, and, of course, hot tea. Many nights, Shek shared his own food with his little brother. "Make sure you finish every grain of rice for Ma," he would say. The brothers slept in a tent so fragile the harsh wind nearly blew it away. But inside the tent each night, Shek cupped little Wang's hand and helped his brother practice his Chinese calligraphy. Once a month, they wrote to their mother and sent money across the sea to her. "Ma," they wrote, "we hope you are able to buy some crops with this money. Please do not worry about us. Even in this foreign land, someday our family will be rich forever. Your sons, Shek and Wong. One hot afternoon, the brothers were still working to cross the Sierras when the boss pulled little Wong aside. You, coolie, we have to blow up this side of the mountain to build a tunnel for the tracks. You are the smallest. Get into the basket to set the dynamite. With the little English he knew, Shek shouted, He too young. I am small too. I set dynamite. He was afraid his little brother would lose his fingers or toes in the explosion. The boss nodded. Lowered in the handmade basket, Shek balanced himself against the harsh wind. He made sure the wick on the dynamite was long enough so the workers had plenty of time to pull him up and away from the blast. Using a hand pick, he dug a small opening and placed the dynamite carefully into the hole. After Shek lighted the wick, he shouted, Fighty! Hurry up! Wong and the workers quickly pulled him away from the blast. On the ground, Shek sighed with relief. As seasons passed, the Chinese laborers carried twice their expected workloads at astonishing speeds. At the end of exhausting workdays, Shek and Wong were always glad to get back to their tent. One time, as they headed to their camp on the newly leveled earth, Shek turned to admire a trestle they had just finished. Someday our family will see our great accomplishment, he said to his little brother. The Chinese worked in 12-hour shifts. They pecked, drilled, and hacked through more and more mountains and hard rock face. Conditions grew dangerously worse. Then the Chinese workers discovered that other, non-Chinese laborers were paid more than they. Were they discriminated against because of their long queues and almond-shaped eyes? The Chinese laborers thought so. They spoke little English and felt helpless. Then, one June day, some 3,000 graders, tunnelmen, and road pavers joined forces and stopped working. They chanted over and over in English, equal pay, equal hours. The bosses were furious. We're not going to tolerate this. No water and no food until you return to work. If you don't cooperate, we'll send you all back to China. The cooks sneaked barrels of hot tea for the protesters to survive during the cold nights. But with the lack of food and water, in days many of them grew weak. Many of them wondered if the protest should continue. Finally, one night, the workers gathered. Many spoke. Then Shek stood up. We will all starve if we continue to strike. We must not forget why we came here. Nobody answered. Then, one by one, the workers nodded. They thought of their suffering families back home and agreed to return to work the next day. That very night, Shek wrote to reassure their mother. Ma, please do not worry. We have plenty to eat here in this land of opportunity. Our family will never go hungry again, and soon we will have a feast together. Shek. The United States government pushed the railroad companies to complete the railroad project faster and faster. The two companies were paid by the number of miles. The bosses, in turn, demanded and pushed their workers to perform faster and faster. Over the winter, the laborers raised trestles, shoveled the fills, and built mile after mile of snow sheds until they finally came down to the foothills in Nevada. There, a snowstorm raged across the countryside. With fear of an avalanche, one had swept away a crew of workers a year earlier. The laborers shoveled relentlessly through the blanket of snow. As usual, Shek made sure his little brother was by his side. Then, in the late afternoon, While the storm still raged, a roaring, crashing sound rolled down on them. Avalanche! Panicked, Wong peered through the windy snow. Shek, where are you? He shouted. There was no sign of his older brother anywhere. Wong shouted in Chinese at the other workers. My brother is buried in the snow. Please, please, help find him. He'll freeze to death. The boss ran up from the rear and grabbed Wong's arm. Back to work. You coolie, enough. Back to work. Wong pulled himself free and began to dig frantically through the snow with his bare hands. He remembered his older brother's words that they would never be apart. Finally, Wong saw the tip of Shek's boot protruding above the alp of snow. Gao Man! He shouted. Help! He had found him. The workers helped to dig Shek out of the snow. They found him half frozen and clinging to his shovel, but alive. Wong took off his brown smock and wrapped it around his older brother's frostbitten body. The cook ran to him with a cup of hot tea as the workers carried Shek over to a bamboo mat in a nearby tent. In his arms, Wong cradled Shek and massaged his older brother's shivering body until it began to feel warm. Yum cha, Wong said. Drink tea, my brother. I will get better, Shek muttered back. I must. As the days passed, Shek became better and better. Though he lost 2 toes from frostbite, he was soon back at his brother's side, back at his sledgehammer, hammering the rails across the deserts and mountains and prairies of the western expanse. 4 years later, it was spring 1869, the Chinese laborers made their way to Promontory Summit, Utah. The 2 railway lines, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, built by the Irish workers from the east and mostly Chinese workers from the west, would meet there. When they met, there was a big celebration. Railroad managers, townspeople, and other workers were invited, but not the Chinese, not the coolies. Wong and Shek stood back and watched the ceremony from behind the crowd of reporters and cameras. We know, Shek said to Wong. Call us what you will. It is our hands that helped build the railroad. After the ceremony, the brothers did not go back to China. Instead, they took the money they had saved and rode west on the new train to find a new home. They settled in San Francisco. One day, gathering his thoughts, Wong took out his brush and ink block and started to write. Ma, it has been quite some time since we last wrote. Shek is busy minding the store. Already the community in Chinatown knows me as the letter writer. Now I help those who can't read and write send letters home to their families in China. We are hopeful and excited that soon we shall be reunited with you and our brothers here in America, the land of opportunity, Wong. Soon enough, the brothers sent money home again. However, this time it was money for their family to join them in America. Paw starts a fire in the wastebasket and prepares the firecrackers in the backyard. Now, are you ready to pay respect to our ancestors? My grandmother calls out to me. Take the paper money and gold paper and throw it in the flames. It will make your ancestors rich in the spirit world forever. As I watch the ashes disappear into the sky, I know I will remember my ancestors. How could I forget? Author's note. The story was inspired by actual historical events in the history of the American Railroad. Thousands of Chinese fled to America in the mid-1800s because of famine and the Taiping Rebellion, in which...
Okay, so those are all things that we've covered as well. So again, hopefully that was helpful. So if you want to take some time now to cover some of these questions with your student, just to see how much they remember about the story. And so take a few minutes to do that. Okay, so these are some good questions to cover with your student, just to see what they got out of the book Coolies. So one thing that might not be totally clear is why they were called coolies. So I'm going to give you a little bit more background on that. So the hats that they would wear, those straw hats that kind of come up to a point, they were called cool-off hats. And so the Chinese were well known for wearing those. And so that's where the phrase coolies comes from. So hopefully that helps with that. So this is a picture with the descendants of the Chinese railroad workers came together to celebrate at Promontory Point. So this is a reenactment. So really trying to get the attention and credit that their ancestors deserved. This is a good time for some writing practice. So this is an opinion writing practice, something that my fourth grader's been doing a lot lately. So we call this an Oreo writing exercise. So the prompt or the question we're going to try to answer here is, what do you think about the rights that the Chinese workers had? Or the inverse of that, what do you think about the rights that Chinese workers didn't have? So I'll give you extra bonus points if you eat Oreos while you're doing this writing. So this is what the OREO stands for Oreo writing. What is your opinion on the topic? What are your reasons for your opinion? Do you have examples that support your reasons? And then restate your opinion. So that is an Oreo opinion writing piece. So that's a good writing practice. So I wanted to cover what's going on with the Native Americans as well. So we talked a little bit about that already. So looking at the Pawnee, but I always think it's helpful to see where the tribes are living at this time. So you can see a really big chunk of land there is controlled by the Sioux. Sometimes they're referred to as the Lakota as well. And also pay attention to the Cheyenne as well. So they were trading partners with the Sioux as well. So the railroad's going to be running straight through their land. So that's definitely going to have an impact on them. So as I mentioned before, the bison are virtually wiped out to try to get them off of the tracks and to keep the tribes from organizing against the building of the railroad. So this definitely is disputing or disrupting the normal trade patterns of the Cheyenne and the Sioux, as well as other tribes. So they're going to try to resist the building of the railroad. So they're going to lose a lot of land as a result of the US government coming in and buying up all of this territory for the railroad. The Pawnee, as I mentioned earlier, are going to work as scouts for the US Army. And partially they're doing that is because they are normally enemies of the Sioux Nation. So they are going to be siding with the US government on this one. This is an image I always share with my high school students as well. So, a lot of times we hear about, oh yes, the Native American tribes use the buffalo, but I think this is a really nice way to illustrate that. So you've got just every piece of this animal is being used. So the bones are used, the beard, the fur, the hooves, the skull, the hides, the muscles. So every aspect of this animal is being utilized. So it's not just being used for the meat and they're tossing the rest. So really important. Positive impacts of the trains on American history. We figure out pretty quickly that we need time zones because you have trains running together at the same time. So that's something that happens as a result of the railroad. It is definitely going to help the North win the Civil War. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Civil War. So basically, the railroad is being set up while the South is out of the Union. So they're going to be able to use this to decide where to put the tracks. So most of the tracks are going to be in Northern Territory for a long time. And so that's going to make it so that they can move soldiers and supplies a lot more quickly than the South can. Railroad towns are almost automatically become successful towns. It's like just add water and you're good to go. So any town that if you end up having a railroad stop in your town, you've got lots of people getting on and off, your businesses are going to be more successful and that sort of thing. Again, as mentioned before, this is really important for trade. So farmers are going to be able to trade their products a lot farther than they would have previously. Okay, and since the focus here is on California history, we need to ask the question, how is the railroad impacting California history? So we talked last week again about the gold rush. That brings a lot of people into California. Now, some of them are going to leave after the gold rush is over, but pair that up with the railroad, you have a lot more people coming and staying in California. There's a lot of land available in California. We are a very large state. And so this is the start of us becoming an agricultural powerhouse. So we're gonna look more at this in subsequent weeks, especially looking at the California economy. This is a very famous poster advertisement that was made during this time period. So really trying to highlight how much room is available in California. So California, the cornucopia of the world. My guess is our kids might not be familiar with what a cornucopia is or what a horn of plenty is, but basically just, just kind of point them towards the image itself. That you can fit a lot of stuff in there, and usually there's agricultural products or farm products that are put in there. And so I've typed up what the poster actually says there, so you can see that it's highlighting room for lots of people, and that health is of big concern. There's no real big weather problems. We don't have blizzards in California. We don't have tornadoes in California. So all big points for us. So a good question to talk about point of view, or who the author is. Who do you think is making this advertisement? And the answer there is that this is a land company. So a company that owns a lot of land and they want to sell it. So a nice art activity would be to make a poster advertising a train route to a particular city. It could be your own city, could be just a city that you've visited, could be a landmark like Disneyland or something like that. So you choose, and then try to create some sort of image that would entice people to come via train to your place. So think about what you want to highlight. Are there certain activities you want to highlight? Is it just, this is a slower pace of life, that sort of thing? And then think about what kind of images you'll use. You notice the image here, it looks very relaxing. She's sitting on the wall, she's looking out at the water. So think about kind of the mood that you're setting as well. All right, so trains today. So my daughter is very into trains. She wanted to know more about bullet trains, so I put this one in for her.
Today's high-speed trains will have you cruising along at 350 kilometers per hour. A ticket is about the same as a flight, and the door-to-door time on some of the world's most popular routes is the same or less than getting a plane. But decades ago, rail travel was in decline. It faced fierce competition from the air and auto industries. Then came Japan's bullet train. By the late 1950s, Japan's economic miracle had transformed the war-ravaged nation. Its economy was growing quickly. The area between Tokyo and Osaka was booming with industry. People were flocking to the capital for work, but the rail line connecting the two major cities couldn't take the stress. In 1958, a government panel was set up to tackle the problem, and several potential solutions arose. Among them, building the world's first high-speed rail line. Many were skeptical, but two men were true believers. Shinji Sogo was the then president of the state-run Japanese National Railway. The other, Sogo's colleague, veteran engineer Hideo Shima. Up against bureaucratic obstacles and fierce opposition, the two drove the project forward. In 1959, the Tokaido Shinkansen line started construction under Sogo's leadership. Shima was appointed the project's chief engineer. His team designed the sleek and revolutionary cone-shaped front from which the bullet train got its name. Rather than being pulled by an engine in front, each carriage of the bullet train was driven by an individual electric motor, which has proven to be safer, faster, and more efficient. Apart from the train itself, the team also built wider tracks, which were more costly, but allowed for greater stability and higher speeds. 3,000 bridges and 67 tunnels were built on the 515-kilometer line to allow a clear and largely curveless path. Older trains were banned from the new line. Equipped with advanced technologies, the new trains were able to travel as fast as 210 kilometers per hour, a breakthrough in the passenger rail industry and the world's fastest at the time. The journey time between Tokyo and Osaka was cut from over 6 hours to 4. On October 1st, 1964, the new line opened just in time for the Tokyo Olympic Games.
10月1日午前6時、万歳と拍手に送られて東京駅を静かに滑り出す光1号。
But neither Sogo nor Shima were invited for the inauguration. They both resigned in 1963 because the project's budget came in at double what was promised, 400 billion yen, the equivalent of 3.6 billion US dollars today. But despite their premature departure, the Tokaido Shinkansen line was an immediate success and quickly turned a profit. It transformed the nation, allowing more people to work in metropolitan areas, and became a symbol of Japan's post-war re-emergence as an economic and tech power. Now, over 300 trains operate on the line every day, and the trip between Tokyo and Osaka has shortened to 2.5 hours. The number of passengers has also soared, reaching 165 million in 2016. After the success of the Tokaido Shinkansen line, Japan has continued expanding its high-speed rail network and plans to build more. Following Japan's lead, countries like France, Germany and China have also developed high-speed railways. By the end of 2018, the total length of high-speed rail network in the world will be over 46,000 kilometers, and over half of it is in China.
Okay, so great info there. So that just kind of brings us up to modern day. So we've gone from these steam-powered locomotives that we saw in the 1860s to diesel, and then up until electric and the bullet trains. So good info there. All right, so just some more kind of fun activities. I think this is fun, especially for our younger students, a little word search. So feel free to go to that website and print it out, or you could even just, pause the screen and just with their fingers see how many of these words they can find. So something kind of fun there. So just to let you know where we're planning on heading next, assuming we're not back in school by any of these dates. So I went through the California Social Studies standards, and so these are the ones that I kind of landed on. Also got some recommendations from our daughter's teacher as well. So next week we'll look at California's admission as a state, the Compromise of 1850, and then how that leads to the Civil War. So we'll look at California's role in the Civil War. The following week we'll look at how our government is structured, so local, so looking at our city, county, state, and federal government, and what the role of a citizen is. So this kind of civic education I just think is so important for our students to have their whole lives. So we'll walk through that, what our responsibilities are as a citizen. We'll take a week off for what normally would have been our spring break, so there'll be no lesson on April 13th. But then the following weekend, we'll pick up with California in the year 1900 and go to World War II. Following week, we'll do post-World War II era up to modern day. So that'll be kind of broad brushstrokes there, but we'll get a viewpoint on how California has become such a dynamo in terms of powerful states. And then May 4th, we'll look at California, the environment, and the economy with special emphasis on water rights. So hopefully this is interesting to you and your students. If you have thoughts on other topics that we could cover, please let me know. And hopefully this is helpful and giving your students something to work on as we are still on hiatus as a result of the coronavirus. So hope you guys all have a good day. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to see any products that your students make, whether it's the math problem or it's the art activity or the writing activity. It makes me so happy to see these products and the things that they're working on. So thanks again for joining me on this adventure all aboard our Transcontinental Railroad today. Have a great day.